Here There Be Dragons, Jane Austen's Dragons, a Regency gas lamp dragon fantasy adventure, Book 12. Written by Maria Grace. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. August 23rd, 1815. Sir Frederick Wentworth, still trying to grow accustomed to his new title of baronet, sat back in his chair and smoothed the letter over the blotter on his cluttered desk, pushing books aside to arrange it alongside the other 3 letters, all recounting similar events. A sea-scented breeze rushed through the windows and down the narrow room, leaving him scrambling for paperweights to hold down his carefully arranged correspondence. Blast it! Where had he put the other one? He grabbed a book from the shelves on the long wall opposite the windows. That would do for now. Anne would tease that it was a sign he needed to clean his office. And she would, of course, be right. But would that motivate him to change his bad habits? Probably not. How could one think when worried about keeping so large a space in precise order? Small, shipboard spaces were so much easier to manage with efficiency. The breeze rushed out like a wave returning to sea, and he turned back to his letters. Sir Fitzwilliam Darcy, Pendragon Knight and Keeper of Pemberley, in his strong, distinctive handwriting, offered him the facts of a dragon kidnapped from a girls' school, arranged and carried out by other dragons, who intended to put the victim in the hands of dragon poachers. The regional under-secretary of Derbyshire, a Mr. Withington, had the matter well in hand and was activating the keepers of Derbyshire to watch for such activity against the minor dragons of the region. A Lady Marie Dunn, who appeared to have been involved in the affair, had connections in the shipping trade at Lyme. Though Darcy had no actual authority to direct Wentworth's efforts, the implications were clear enough, all the while leaving things sufficiently vague enough to give Wentworth room to do what he saw fit. A proper and gentlemanly way to handle what could be a rather sensitive situation. Rather sensitive? When had he become so politic? Wentworth snorted and stared at the ceiling. A fragment of a dusty cobweb waved at him from the corner. Sometimes it seemed he hardly knew himself any more. Was that because he was land-bound now, or a keeper and a gentleman? Difficult to tell. Sir Richard Fitzwilliam, Pendragon Knight and Keeper to Netherford, showed his military colours in his missive's very first words. Crisp, clear, and to the point, he detailed the suspected connection between Lady Marie and the shipping business, the role and connections of her minion Sandford, and explained the role of Nob, the dragon kidnapper, and his friends the dairy farmers, near Sparrowspit and Chapel-en-le-Frit, not because it was strictly necessary, but because it might be significant. Fitzwilliam included the noteworthy bit of information as to how Miss Georgiana Darcy had been involved in the affair, and how she was now under his and Netherford's watch. That would make Fitzwilliam's life more complicated, would it not? Interesting. Not 1, but 2 minor dragons were taken. Miss Darcy's, what would one call her, a fellow student, an acquaintance, and the friend of Sir Horace's sons. If only the poachers realized their plots affected 3 Pendragon Knights in one go. A serious tactical error on their part. General Strickland, Minister of Dragon Defence, wrote in greater depth, tying the smugglers to the poachers in an elaborate web of connections that would take some time to sort out. Some associations seemed rather weak and made ties between the different actors that were, at best, tenuous, at worst, fanciful. But at this stage of an investigation, that was to be expected. Not surprisingly, several pieces of the web led to the ports at Lyme. Would Wentworth please increase his efforts to investigate them? Now? One more thing for his ever-growing list, and for Anne's. Admiral Easterly's letter from the office of the Blue Order Chief Naval Liaison, the most recent of the missives, was the most interesting. Well, interesting if one found impatience and frustration interesting. Though Easterly did not come out and say as much, he was under no little pressure to get the sea dragon matter moving. Unfortunately, there was nothing he nor Wentworth could do to make it happen any faster, something Lord Matlock did not appreciate. Wentworth rubbed his temples and squeezed his eyes shut, but it provided little relief against the headache triggered by Easterly's subtle accusations. How many months had elapsed since he and Anne had occupied the estate at Lyme, all without a single genuine interaction with the reclusive sea dragons? Nearly 8 months now. Though, to be fair, some of that time had been spent in London, dealing with Lady Elizabeth's kidnapping and the cotillion. Even so, it was taking longer to begin the talks than any of them had anticipated. But what did the Order expect? That the sea dragons would be waiting for Wentworth at the beach, treaty in hand, ready to sign? No, not even General Strickland was so ambitious, though he would have appreciated such a thing. No doubt the pressure came from Lord Matlock himself. That seemed in keeping with the Chancellor's character. Good thing he was in London, and not Lyme. Anne pushed the door open with her shoulder, bearing a tray of tea-things that she had refused to allow the housekeeper to manage. No, he had not asked for them. No, he hardly needed them. But he did need her company, and her thoughtful insights. Two seemed to come hand in hand. Perhaps she needed the tea-tray as an excuse to barge into his office. Ah, well, if it made her feel better about the most welcome intrusion, then he would drink tea and partake of whatever biscuits or sandwiches or what-nots appeared with the teapot. The sacrifices he would make. Best hide that smile before Anne caught sight, and stared at him until he told her all his wandering thoughts. She stood in the doorway a moment, both demure and enticing, in her dark blue walking ensemble. How did she manage that? Admiral Easterly's letter is troubling. I imagine he is complaining about delays again. She glanced around the too full of furniture study for a place to set the tea-tray. He hurried to clear a small table crowded in the middle of 3 leather chairs near the unlit fireplace. Indeed, his current complaint might surprise you, though. He deposited the stack of books near the embroidered fireplace screen as she swallowed a sigh. I am intrigued. Are you to tell me, or shall I guess? She set down the tea-tray, and Wentworth strode back to the desk to retrieve the letter and handed it to her. He does not approve of you wasting time investigating smugglers when you have more significant matters to attend to. She returned it to him, her upper lip curled in confusion, or perhaps disgust. Surely negotiating treaties with the sea dragons who refuse to make an appearance is more important, no? Anne sighed, probably for dramatic effect. Had Kellynch been teaching her that? You well know my feelings on that matter. As frustrating as it might be, one cannot negotiate with someone who will not appear. I do not see why the Admiral struggles so with the concept. Whose fault do you think the lack of dragon encounters is? He fell into the chair across from Anne. Perhaps a cup of tea would do him good after all. Clearly yours. I assume that is because you have not done enough to contact them. She poured a cup of tea. The warm herbal fragrance floated in the air. Yes, tea was a splendid idea. Nothing short of utter success and a signed treaty would have been sufficient for him, I think. I did not think the Admiral so unreasonable. Anne poured herself a cup and gestured to a plate of nibbly things on the tray. I am sure it does not originate from him. I have known him for a long time, and never seen this sort of irritability from him. There must be considerable pressure to prove the worth of having a naval liaison to sea dragons, beyond getting said dragons to agree to a treaty. Never underestimate the insecurities of a man promoted to a new rank. He liberated a cucumber sandwich from the plate. What a strange thing to have developed a taste for. But so far, there are no sea dragons willing to liaise with us. I fear that makes him a failure in the eyes of someone above him who is willing to pin the blame upon me. He stretched his legs and leaned his head over the top of the chair to stare at the cracked ceiling plaster. You are worried you will no longer have work with the Order if success eludes you? Wentworth muttered under his breath. Nothing will change your role as Keeper to Kellynch, you know, so you will always have that and the estate to manage. For many that is enough. He turned his face aside. Why did she have to look at him that way? If you need more than that, why would they not put a willing and capable man like you to use with one thing or another? She set her teacup down and levelled narrowed hazel eyes at him. But you do not want to just do one thing or another, do you? Frustrating woman. There were no secrets, no privacy with her, always knowing his very thoughts. How is bringing the sea dragons into the Blue Order not in the best interests of all involved? Laconia sprang onto the window-sill and peeked around the fluttering curtain.
I might have some insight into the troubles with that.
Springing off his powerful serpentine tail, Laconia landed on the desk, directly on 3 of the letters he had been reading. Powerful and elegant, the black tatzelworm had the front half of a cat, with thumbed paws, the back half of a snake, and all the sense of the best officer Wentworth had ever served with. Few men were privileged to have such a loyal and stalwart friend. You have news. Wentworth crossed to the desk and shifted another pile to the floor to make room for Laconia.
A flock of seafaring cockatrices just came in ahead of a rather significant storm. As is their wont, they are chattery. Amidst all the stuff and nonsense, they had some intriguing insights.
Laconia licked his shoulder, leaving a tuft of fur sticking straight up. Pray enlighten us. Anne went to his side and perched on the edge of the desk. She scratched behind his ears and smoothed his fur. Laconia purred and flicked his tail in a satisfied sort of way. Life with Anne was making the tatzelworm soft, both of them really, and neither of them were complaining about it.
There is some disagreement about the details, as is always the case when dealing with a flock, but all the narratives agree that there is division among the sea dragons as to what should be done,
Laconia said. They? Is that to say the sea dragons are organized, like a Blue Order conclave? Anne asked.
No, not exactly, and that is part of the problem.
Laconia's tail swished and sent one letter fluttering to the floor.
If they were organized, I think this would be far clearer and easier. Organization does not exist at that level for the sea dragons.
If they are not organized, how then does it appear there is a division in what should be done, and what exactly is the thing that should or should not be done? Wentworth asked.
Yes.
Laconia licked his paw and rubbed it over his face.
There is a far greater variety in sea dragons than in land dragons. Many, like the serpent whales, are organized into pods or schools or similar groups. Others are solitary. Some are migratory, so they do not define their territory in the sense that we would understand territory. Others have definite territories, but they are quite 3-dimensional, defined by depth, not just longitude and latitude. That is something we do not find intuitive. Those who are solitary may or may not have cooperative connections with others of their kind. Some species seem, on the whole, more amenable to cooperation with their fellows, and their feelings about warm-bloods and terrestrial dragons vary as well.
Curious. How many of the assumptions the Order made about all things draconic would apply to the sea dragons? They knew there would be differences, but perhaps not so many. Wentworth rubbed his chin. So what you are saying is that they may be far from ready to enter negotiations with the Blue Order.
As a collective, absolutely, that is the case. And the sooner the Order recognizes it, the better.
Laconia pressed his head into Anne's hand for more ear scratches. And you had not thought to mention that sooner. The Order will not like that one whit. Wentworth huffed and paced the length of the narrow room.
Kellynch and I thought it seemed too obvious to bother bringing up. He does not want to offend your delicate, warm-blooded sensibilities. I, on the other hand,
Laconia's tail slapped the desk as if to add,
have no scruples about letting you know your shortcomings. Not that all hope is lost, though. It was naive in the first place to think they could replicate an event like penning the Pendragon Accords. It was a singular moment in history.
What are you suggesting, then?
Negotiating with the entire body of sea dragons makes as much sense as trying to negotiate with the whole of Europe, thinking of it as a single entity when it is not. Many believe that is what Devi and Pendragon did, but if you study the histories closely, that is not what happened.
You make an excellent point, Anne said. There were years of negotiations that took place after the initial treaty, before the accords were finally written and the Blue Order established. Perhaps that is the model we should be following here as well. Do you think it possible to interact with smaller groups of the sea dragons to create some meaningful connections? That might pave the way for larger agreements later.
That should have been the plan from the beginning. Easterly and Strickland were fools to consider otherwise.
Laconia's tail thumped against the desk. He was not known for subtle opinions. It sounds as though you have a starting place already in mind. Anne stroked the fur on his shoulders, and the thumping stilled.
Of course, the local sea dragons have been avoiding Kellynch up to this point. He is, after all, a very large intruder in their territory. They have been watching to better understand both his intent toward them and his approach toward establishing dominance. Kellynch and I have been discussing the situation.
Of course they had. Wentworth raked his hair and scratched his head. Yes, it was uncomfortable. Laconia and Kellynch talking behind his back. But exactly what excellent officers should do for their superior. That they were dragons should not matter, did not matter. But it required a bit of adjustment on his part. It seems, then, we should discuss that together. Shall we pay a call to the sea cave, then? Wentworth gestured toward the cliffside cave that Kellynch preferred over his terrestrial lair. Anne shook her head. You know how I feel about trying to enter Kellynch's unofficial den. Besides, Mr. Allenden is expecting me this afternoon to collect the keeper's correspondence and reports. I shall have to ask you to fill me in later. Wentworth snorted. And before you ask, he still appears to consider dealing with me below his dignity. She shrugged and tossed her head, but that did not hide the truth of how much his attitude disturbed her. Though dragons might value females on equal terms, it did not ensure that the men of the Blue Order followed suit. An oversight which I find difficult to forgive. Wentworth folded his arms and frowned, something she claimed he did at every mention of the Blue Order magistrate.
"He is little different to her father."
Laconia licked his shoulder. I am not certain I would agree with that, but then again, now that you bring it up, I can see a certain similarity in their outlooks. Quite set in their ways and determined to believe those who are not like them are rather a contemptible lot, Anne said. The Order should have better sense than to put that sort of man in a position of authority. But then again, so should the Navy. But that did not stop them either. Wentworth ran his tongue along his bottom teeth. It would be pleasant if there were more choice among who might serve in such positions. Anne's voice took on those diplomatic notes she used when trying to soothe prickly souls. But there is no control over who hears dragons, so choice is always limited to that. Have you forgotten? But until recently, Lyme did not have a local dragon estate. Though the number of dragon hearers in England is small, it seems even smaller in this region. I wonder why there are so few coastal estates. Laconia step-slithered toward him, and put his paws on Wentworth's shoulders.
"You should remember that you are dominant over the county officer, who, I might remind you, does not even have a dragon friend. It would not be untoward to remind him of your dominance."
Chapter 2. Anne fastened her spencer and tied her hat in place with a double knot that the vicar's widow, who lived in a cottage near the Spittals, had taught her. It had taken some time and an unfortunate toll on her headwear to get accustomed to the constant wind the shore seemed to require. Wentworth and Laconia paid it little mind, which made sense as it was as natural to them as the countryside was to her. Wentworth kissed her good-bye and headed toward the sea-cave, whilst she turned toward Lyme. The crunchy gravelled path she followed would soon melt into the steep, narrow road that traversed through the Spittals woods, past Kellynch by the sea, and into town. She could have called for the coach to convey her the mile and a half, but such a display of wealth would have been unseemly, not to mention the unnecessary wear on the equipage, and it would have denied her the experience of the lovely day. She turned her face to the sun, relishing its kiss on her cheeks. A gust of wind carried the smell of the woods to her, like a gift of something familiar and homey. Yes, that was exactly what she needed. This was home now. It was nice when sometimes it felt that way too. Though almost daily she found new things to adjust to. Kellynch embraced his transition to an estate proper for a marine worm. He all but considered it a concert when the seabirds made their noisy calls, relished every whiff of salt air, all but basked in it, played in the crashing waves at high tide at each new moon, cavorting like the tatzelwormlings, corn and wool. In short, he was a content dragon these days, utterly transformed from the cross, resentful creature he had been at Kellynch Hall. All things considered, though, it was hard to hold that against him. Cheated by Cornwall, and wronged by Lady Russell. No, it was Viola now. One day the new name would become second nature to her. Any rational being would respond with ire. Vengeance would have been a more typical reaction for a dragon in his state. Perhaps the Order was recognizing his patience when they assigned him so desirable an estate. Of course, one did not say that sort of thing outright, but it seemed to explain some of the favour shown to such a low-ranking dragon. There had been a few moments of concern that Kellynch would resent the lowly title of laird, but with a newly titled seaman for a keeper, and Corn and Wall as his own adoring dragon friends, something no other major dragon boasted, was there anything that could increase his contentment? Those things were good, yes, definitely good, exactly as they should be. She glanced over her shoulder. The tidy white manor peeked over the horizon, bidding her goodbye, and the road dropped lower and blocked the view. It was a pleasant, generous house, though it did not compare to Kellynch Hall. Still, the household ran with a proper budget, with money set aside for future crises, of which there were sure to be more than one. Without worries of debt and a lavish lifestyle to maintain, the household was a joy to manage. Yes, everything was good, very good. She sighed as her foot slipped on the gravel. This was the spot where one had to tread with caution to avoid a most embarrassing fall. But even in that she could hardly grumble. They had a road to the estate, and it was decently maintained. Everything was good. Good. Oh, how she hated that simple word. That things were good made it difficult to confront that things were not perfect. It seemed self-centered to complain. Though she might not make mention of it, the fact remained. Without female companionship, she was lonely. How difficult that was to admit. How ungrateful it sounded, even in her own ears. But there it was. At Kellynch Hall there had been Elizabeth and Lady Russell, who admittedly were not ideal companions, but they were present, and the Musgroves and the Tennants. There were ladies around her to take tea and share conversations about something other than seafaring. But here, perhaps they had not been in Lyme long enough to meet the right people. But for now, it seemed everyone had some connection to the sea. To the sea, but not to dragons. That was the material point. Theirs was the only dragon estate near Lyme, and one of the few near the coast in the whole of England. Most landed dragons avoided the shore. None really knew why, but they did. One more aspect of her life that set her apart from her circle of acquaintance. The place she should have felt most at home, the local Blue Order office, proved less than welcoming. Magistrate Allendon's draconic personality had ensured he had no dragon friend, only a Secretary Drake assigned by the Order, which probably made matters worse. Without local dragon estates from which to draw a magistrate, he was one of the few from the mercantile class who served in that office, an office he resented, perhaps even more strongly than most men called to serve in the role. The non-existent pay, the time it drew from his business, and the lack of personal connection to dragons made his resentment understandable. Understandable, but not tolerable. He was perpetually put out with his secretary, who, while competent, was young, inexperienced, and, unfortunately, female. Suffering a female secretary was bad enough, but dealing with Anne as well. He seemed to take umbrage at a mere woman holding a role as significant as a special liaison to the main London office. More than once she had heard him muttering under his breath that he was perfectly capable of managing such matters, and it was an insult that the Order brought in someone else, much less a woman, to take on those responsibilities. Ironic, considering how little he wanted any dragon-related responsibilities. Funny how many Order members seemed to forget that the preternatural hearing that allowed them to hear dragons also meant that other dragon hearers overheard them. One would think that at the Order offices at least, which were populated solely by hearers, they would exercise a bit more caution. But then again, the officers were but a back room, behind his imported goods shop, above which he lived. So the entire arrangement at Lyme lacked the isolation and privacy that were to be had even in a county office like Dorset. Ah, well, perhaps it was for the best that she understood where Mr. Allendon stood, and could set her expectations accordingly. The road paused at its lowest point just outside Lyme, making the town feel more daunting than it should have. Houses, cottages, and shops dotted the sides of the street as it wound its way up to the top of the hill, where the Order offices perched. Mr. Allenden's shop occupied a large 4-story building at the intersection of 3 busy roads and 2 smaller lanes. An excellent location for a business that benefited from the traffic of vacationers on their holidays. 3 dark-framed arched windows and a matching doorway punctuated the white stone front. A matching wooden sign with large white letters extended across the entire width of the building, announcing "Finest Imported Goods." The unremarkable rectangular windows on the floors above had no framing, helping to focus attention on the shop below. Outside, shoppers gathered at the storefront, pointing to the various treasures and trinkets within. A steady stream of patrons came and left through the double front doors. Anne nodded at the customers as she passed the doors and 4 other pedestrians along the way before she came to the narrow alley that led to the mews behind the shop. Dark and dreary, only later in the day would the sun reach high enough to enter the pinched mews. Several sheds and a well dotted the length of the alley as back doors and cellar stairs opened onto it. There, the blue-painted door, shabby and in need of a good cleaning and a fresh coat of paint, marked the Blue Order office rooms for Line Regis. Anne jangled the bell by the door and waited. Some days it could be rather a long wait. Mr. Allenden often ignored it, with the excuse that he was serving his customers, which may or may not have been true. After a minute she rang it twice more. The housekeeper upstairs listened for that signal and would come down to let Anne in. The lock rattled, and the blue door inched open. "Good morning, Lady Wentworth." The housekeeper, Mrs. Frankel, nodded and ushered her inside. Instead of an entry hall, she stepped into a long, narrow room with 2 frosted windows, overlooking the mews, and a compact fireplace with a dainty Zoltis basket at the end. Odd chairs and tables, a small writing desk under a painting of the London Order offices, and a few sombre portraits implied this was a parlour of sorts. The doorway at the end led to a dark, slender corridor that contained doors to the records room, which doubled as the magistrate's office, storefront, and the stairs to the living spaces upstairs. "We've been expecting you. It has been quite some time since you've gotten your post. I will put some tea on for you." Short, plump, but not stout, with mounds of red curls peeking from under her mob cap, Mrs. Frankel was a force of nature. A gale on 2 legs that somehow left order rather than chaos in her wake. And Anne was not about to tell that windstorm she did not need tea this morning. Nor was she going to mention that her correspondence was supposed to be delivered to Kellynch by the Sea, if she did not make it in each week to pick it up herself. That was Mr. Allenden's business, not Mrs. Frankel's. "There's a spot of weather happening out in the shop. You may want to sit yourself down and catch a breath a moment while it passes." Mrs. Frankel opened a modest cabinet near the tea-table and pulled out a lovely painted tin. She pried off the lid and set it on the table, filled with clear cakes, marzipan, lemon drops, and barley sugar candy. "A little sweet to fortify you won't hurt none either." Oh, that did not bode well. Should I come back tomorrow? Mrs. Frankel's brow knit, and she pressed her lips together hard. Funny how clear it was when she was thinking. "As I recall, that pile of correspondence looked rather large. Might not want to let it set much longer, I dare say. Oi, mist, you know where Cipher has gone off to?" A dainty green Zoltis, with cloudy grey spots, lifted her snake-like crested head. She glanced at Anne, lazily blinking her long eyelashes, and nodded.
"Good day, Lady Wentworth. The last I heard, Cipher was looking for records in the attic. Shall I inform her you are here for your letters?"
"That would be most agreeable," Mrs. Frankel said, and opened the hall door for Mist to slip out. "She's quite a love now."
"Indeed. Have you been friends for very long?"
"I met her on a trip to Bath when I was but a girl. We've been through a lot together, her and me."
A pang that was most definitely not jealousy pinched Anne's throat. "You are lucky to have one another."
"That we are, Lady Wentworth, that we are."
A bell rang in the distance.
"You will excuse me, I am needed."
Mrs. Frankel curtsied and hurried out. What sort of weather had Mrs. Frankel been hinting at? Was Allendon as ill-tempered with his customers as he was with the order members who required his attention? Not likely. It was probably a supplier or blue order complaint that had him in high dudgeon. Cipher, a dusky red drake with darker markings that resembled cryptic symbols, scurried in with a satchel over her back. Around her neck she wore a blue order livery badge.
"Good day, Lady Wentworth."
"You seem rather out of breath. Are you well?" Cipher looked up at her head cocked and turned sideways.
"Forgive me, but that is an odd thing to ask."
"May I ask why?"
"You suggest I have been running from a predator, that I am behaving like prey. It is insulting."
Anne pressed her hands to her cheeks. "Oh, gracious! I am sorry. I intended nothing of the sort. Pray forgive me."
"Then what did you mean?"
Cipher blinked several times. "That was a good question. Mrs. Frankel mentioned that there was rough weather in the office today."
"There was no weather to speak of. I imagine that was a figure of speech, yes?"
Anne nodded. Cipher twitched her head and tail in time.
"I will never understand why warm bloods insist on speaking what is not true instead of what is. I suppose she might describe it in that way, though. In any case, Mr. Allendon is best not disturbed right now. Mist said you were in search of your correspondence?"
"Yes, it is supposed to be sent to me regularly."
"Is that so? I thought you picked it up here."
"I discussed the matter with Mr. Allendon myself."
"Oh, I see."
Cipher exposed the tips of her fangs, her throat pouch inflating.
"I was not aware. The magistrate has been quite occupied. Perhaps it slipped his mind."
"What has kept him so engaged? Is there some blue order business of which I should be aware?"
"I do not know that it is order business, madam. There are problems in the bay. The seamen and fishermen are upset, and trying to organize some way to deal with matters. Since he has interests with many of them, he has offered to assist."
"Is that what is occupying him right now?"
"I believe so. You need not be concerned about it, though. If you follow me, I can give you your correspondence. Come."
Cipher dropped to all fours and led her to the office. Only a trifling excuse for a window filtered light into the tiny room, more fit for a storage chamber than an office. A student-sized desk with a chair on either side stood in the middle. Bookshelves filled the window wall, and locking cabinets lined the other two walls, leaving only enough space for one to scoot carefully around the desk. It reminded her of Wentworth's descriptions of his quarters aboard ship. Cipher pulled a key from her satchel, and, stretching tall upon back legs, she fumbled with the lock and opened the door. Without thumbs, precise motions like those were difficult. She unlocked the first cabinet and removed a generous stack of letters. Anne rushed to her side and caught them before they scattered on the floor. "Gracious, this is a considerable pile."
"I can ask Mrs. Frankel for the use of a basket for you to take them home with you if you would like,"
Cipher said. "Yes, I think that would be helpful." Cipher scampered out, and Anne turned to the desk. She made a quick sort of the letters, several from the London Order offices, one from the Dragon Sage. More than a few keepers' reports. Allendon conveniently directed all of them to her, now, without even opening them first, so thoughtful of him. What was this? Something from Briarwood. Not just one, but 3. She cracked the topmost seal and unfolded the paper. Dated almost a fortnight ago. How could Mr. Allendon have kept this from her for so long? Mean-spiritedness or simple disorganization? She sank into a hard wooden chair as she scanned the sheet. The blue order ink near the middle of the page stopped her as effectively as a stone wall. Quickly, come quickly. The situation has become urgent. Chapter 3. Wentworth walked out with Anne, keeping her company until the place where the path to Kellynch's sea cave split off from the one to the main road. A lovely day for walking, with a cloudless sky overhead and a brisk breeze to cut the heat. A tunnel leading to the sea cave that Kellynch had claimed as an adjunct to his terrestrial lair would have been nice, but the Minister of Keeps had investigated the possibility of additional tunnels. Those who understood such things declared that the cliff would not support it, so Wentworth left it at that. The dragon tunnels from the terrestrial lair to both the house and the beach would have to suffice. Gravel skidded beneath his feet as the path turned and became quite steep as it descended toward the beach. Even Laconia slipped more than slithered as he followed. The trail would need to be improved soon, but it would be difficult to get the order to fund those improvements. There was a limit to how much they would indulge Kellynch's desires, even if it had been Cornwall himself who had wronged him. Perhaps they might sell some of the sheep Kellynch refused to eat. How he detested mutton. But Kellynch also hated to relinquish anything he considered part of his estate. He could be more of a hoarder than he claimed. Anne found the pathway challenging and the sea cave itself unmanageable. Maybe the promise of enabling her to visit the cave could convince Kellynch to agree to the sale. He grew peevish if she did not visit him often enough. Wentworth skidded again and caught himself on a well-placed rock, where the route took another turn. Dragon's bones. That one got his heart racing. He dragged in a deep, salty breath as the sea breeze slapped him in the face. Been a long time since a slippery deck had got the better of him. Waves lapped at the pebbled shoreline below. Something about that rhythm. Kellynch found it soothing. Though the marine worm denied it, Anne was certain his disposition improved when he could listen to it. She had said the same of Wentworth more than once, even if he denied it as much as Kellynch. More carefully now, Wentworth traversed the last 200 yards to the secluded beach cove, where Kellynch's lair opened into a narrow crevasse far too small for the marine worm to pass through. Kellynch entered the cave via an underwater entrance that no warm blood had ever seen. Excellent for security, but it made access to the sea cave challenging, just as it should be, but still damnably inconvenient. Wentworth and Laconia scanned for any onlookers. Even if someone was concealed in the hillside, Laconia's amazing sense of smell would have found them, in which case he and Laconia would have walked in the other direction, to a substantial boulder where one could sit and appreciate the view until high tide came in and covered the vantage point, or their observer left. But this morning, as was usually the case, they were alone and went straight to the lair's opening. Narrow and jagged, the crevice offered no warm invitation. One had to know the knack for getting past the sharp protrusions that seemed intended to warn away intruders. It had taken Wentworth a full month to sort out the intricacies of the maneuver. The sunlight that struggled to penetrate the fissure revealed the real perfection of the entrance, what appeared to be a complete dead end, sufficient to turn back even the most intrepid young man seeking adventure. Deep in the shadows, though, hidden by a fang-shaped protrusion jutting from above, there was an opening barely large enough for Wentworth to slip behind. Laconia led the way. It was difficult not to envy the ease of his passage. Wentworth squeezed past the sharp fang rock, and climbed several feet up the irregular protrusions which lined the wall, to find the torch and fire kit kept well above the tide line. Even if someone made it this far, the brooding darkness ahead would turn them back. He lit the torch, quite the trick when there was no place to set anything down, and little light with which to manage the feat. Once its orange flames settled into a reliable pattern, he called, "Kellynch, may I enter?"
"Come in, keeper."
Kellynch's voice boomed in weird echoes through the cavern. 2 young tatzelworms appeared in the shadows, Corn and Wall. Kellynch claimed the wormlings, sired by Laconia, as his own dragon friends. What other major dragon had his own dragon friends? But they all seemed quite content with the situation, so who was Wentworth to complain?
"Come see! Come see!"
Corn, the heavier of the 2, with white ears and blue eyes, rose on his black and white serpentine tail and wove back and forth.
"Oh, do settle down and not be a goose. They will see soon enough."
Wall, with the black nose and green eyes, huffed and beckoned them to follow. Now that they were a little more grown, their temperaments had become more distinct. Wall was the sensible one, if anyone could call a young tatzelworm sensible. Corn was all excitement and enthusiasm for everything, often exuberant to a fault, but a delightful companion for a major dragon who had been put upon for so very long. Wet rocks, slippery as a ship's deck in a storm, tried to impede his approach. But he had not forgotten his sea legs. Who could have thought there could be pleasure in the reminder of a slick deck underfoot? But there was. Perhaps that was part of the reason he visited here often. It was certainly not the fragrance that drew him, a mix of barnyard and rotten offal, topped with a blend of salt and fish, the marine worm's musk, unique among all the dragons Wentworth had met. Laconia muttered something under his breath, and followed the wormlings. Steady old sailor that he was, he had little patience for Corn. Though Wall was more tolerable, he found both of them silly indeed.
"So, you deign to visit me again?"
Kellynch rose out of the darkness, 15 or 20 feet long, and thick enough that 2 farmhands would barely join hands around him. He filled the available light with a formidable presence. Spinal ridges, flexible like fins, lined his back, growing smaller towards his tail. He might have been frightening but for the small smile that turned up the edges of his toothy mouth, and the dangling moustache whiskers at the end of his long, grey-green snout that waved with any motion of the air. You make it sound as though our daily calls are insufficient, and you are a neglected creature. Wentworth bowed and wedged his torch into a notch carved into the wall by eons of waves.
"When you put it that way, I suppose I have little evidence to support my complaint,"
Kellynch replied, curling his tail and leaning back on it, like a man in a comfortable chair. Strange image, that.
"Is this a mere social call, or is there business you wish to discuss?"
As I understand, you and Laconia have already been discussing sea dragon matters without me. Wentworth perched on a convenient but not comfortable rock, near the torch, at the shallowest end of Kellynch's pool. Small waves lapped at the stone's base. Laconia climbed, or was that slithered, up the wall, to a small shelf above Wentworth's head, but below Kellynch's.
"You make it sound as though we have been intentionally excluding you,"
Kellynch snorted.
"We would never do such a thing."
"Indeed, but you already have. Laconia intimated you have already begun forming a strategy to approach the sea dragons, but I know nothing about it. Perhaps it is time for you to fill me in on the matter?"
"And perhaps it is time for you to stop talking about the sea dragons, as though you are approaching a singular nation."
Kellinch's tail slapped the water, sending a splash that landed just short of Wentworth's feet. "So I have recently come to understand." Wentworth crossed his arms. "The floor is yours, as it were. Do enlighten me on matters in the ocean."
"It has taken you long enough to ask."
Kellinch wrinkled his snout and snorted, sending ripples down his moustache.
"There are many things you should learn, but we should start at the heart of the matter."
"What, in your opinion, is that?"
"The not small issue of Cornwall."
Kellinch spat the word like poison. He would never forget, and probably never forgive, the way Doge Cornwall had wronged him, and the decades of misery it had caused. Cornwall? He is in his territory, watched by proxy keepers assigned by the minister of the court. What trouble could he cause under such close guard? Kellinch's growl started somewhere near his tail, and grew until it rattled water droplets off the stones above.
"You do realize he was livid that he did not win his case before the Blue Order court?"
"It does not require the dragon sage to understand that." Wentworth wiped several cold drips from his forehead.
"What do you think his proxy keepers do in the wake of his temper tantrums?"
"What sort of tantrums?" Kellinch's lip curled back in a frightening sneer.
"His territory has been in an uproar since the court issued the ruling. The local minor dragons have had no peace from him. Several have abandoned their territory to find better."
"That is serious, and I suppose difficult to manage."
"The sort of things the warm-bloods should report back to the Order, but are unlikely to, for fear of how it reflects upon them."
"Even worse,"
Laconia added, in an eerie voice from above.
"That leaves much of his territory without proper management, since the minor dragons did much of the administrative work."
"Whilst you are correct," Kellinch said, "I might argue that for your purposes the complications with the local sea dragons are far more problematic."
"What has Cornwall to do with the local sea dragons?" Wentworth swallowed bile, bitter at the back of his throat.
"Terrorizing, enslaving, making outright enemies of them."
Kellinch seemed to shrug, which was difficult for a dragon without shoulders. Pendragon's bones! How could he do such a thing? Wentworth slammed his fist into his palm. What specifically is he doing? We cannot afford to make enemies of those dragons.
"I am afraid it may be too late. The list is extensive. Let me see."
Kellinch's brow furrowed as he blinked rapidly in thought.
"There is a populous pod of serpent whales that he drove out of their usual feeding grounds, usurping the territory from them. He has conscripted several marine worms to reach the treasure from the merchant royal on his behalf. I do not think he has had much success, though, as they are not as large as I, and cannot dive to that depth. What else now?"
Kellinch's flowing moustache twitched. "There is more?"
He has forbidden a herd of hippocampus to cross his territory, keeping them away from their breeding grounds, which is far more problematic than most warm bloods would imagine. And I have heard tell that he is looking for an emissary to a dominant marine drake who claims a significant part of the English coast as his territory. As I understand, Cornwall seeks to begin talks with said drake on his own behalf, not the Blue Order's.
Cold shivers, or was that another splash of cave water, slithered down Wentworth's back. How is this possible? He is a royal dragon. How could he betray the order like that?
He believes himself betrayed by the order. Why do you expect its dictates will stop the second most powerful dragon in England?
So, in short, what you are telling me is that while we are here trying to establish relations with the sea dragons, Cornwall is at land's end, making enemies of them all?
Not all of them. He has made a few allies, and they appear to be acting on his behalf against the other sea dragons.
But why would they do his bidding against their own kind?
Remember, there is not a single kind of sea dragon. I believe he is exploiting the existing rivalries between the different species.
But why would they align themselves with a land dragon?
I believe a sea drake has been teaching him to swim.
Swim? Him? A fire drake? Is that possible?
I know it is laughable, even disgusting, truth be told. He is no sea dragon, mind you, but the tales I have heard suggest that he is adapting to the task. Once he gains proficiency in the water, he expects to be the dominant dragon in the region, and gain allies by promising them territories within his own claims.
Territory? He is trying to claim more territory?
You heard his argument in court. He believes his territory extends well into the sea. You don't think the council dragon's rebuke dissuades him, do you? An old and powerful fire drake like him would never let such a thing stand in his way. Lust for territory and power is quite the motivation.
Chapter 4. Anne returned to the house as quickly as the steep hills allowed. Perhaps she had been short-sighted not to have taken the carriage, but who could have anticipated such news? Wentworth and Laconia were still with Kellynch. Was it a good thing or a bad one? Kellynch always liked company, and sometimes he was reluctant to let them go. But it might also mean things were as complicated as Laconia had intimated. Her heart pounded harder until she untied her hat and laid it atop the basket of letters which cried out for her attention. Now was not the time to borrow trouble and worry about Kellynch's disposition. There were complications of her own to deal with. Calling to the housekeeper that she was not to be disturbed, Anne hurried up the stairs, still breathing hard from her journey home. Sometimes Lyme seemed as bad as Bath, with everything being inconveniently uphill. She all but dashed down the first-floor hallway and locked herself in her office. Though Wentworth had welcomed her to share his study, and she did on occasion, she also kept a small room upstairs for her personal use. Wentworth was too, dare she say, untidy to share a working space with him. After so many years constrained to the most economical shipboard arrangements, it seemed he liked stacks and piles, and having everything in arm's reach. She did not, and since they had sufficient unused rooms to make it possible, she indulged her preference with no strain on the budget at all. Tucked between two grand rooms designed for company, the last occupants had used her office for storage. Odd furniture, boxes and trunks, and a great deal of dust had filled the space, wall to wall and floor to ceiling. Thank heavens that dusty smell was gone, replaced by the lingering sense of wood polish and a potpourri of lavender kept in a bowl on the window-sill. Clearing out the storage had been a useful exercise, as it had revealed all the furnishings for an office were already available. Granted, they did not perfectly match, but with no one but herself to please, that was hardly an issue. 3 long steps across and 4 deep, her office accommodated little pacing, but there was a hall outside for that, so she hardly felt the loss. A small window let in afternoon light and warmth sufficient for her needs. A plain, sturdy writing desk, with only a blotter, porcelain inkstand, and wax jack gracing the top, stood in front of the window. Worn oak cabinets on either side held her tidy journals and papers, making it easy to find what she needed when she needed it. A bookcase with well-organized books, 2 chairs, baskets for the tatzelworms, a perch for Blue Order messengers, and a stool to accommodate other dragons who occasionally came to see her, made it as welcoming as an official workspace could be. At least she found it so. Anne sat behind her desk, the hard chair reminding her she needed to find a cushion for it. There had to be something in the house that would make do until she had the opportunity to craft one specific to the purpose. With a cautious sigh, she laid the basket of correspondence atop the desk and stared at it. Foolish. Nothing lurked inside to bite her. Only news of Lady Russell, Viola. She needed to read those letters from Briarwood Sanctuary, now, and get it over with. Perhaps it had been a mistake to have all letters from there go through the order offices, waiting upon the whims of Mr. Allenden for delivery. Still, though, that extra measure of distance felt right, at least for now, and maybe for much longer. Viola's betrayal was of the most bitter sort. Enough of that. Such thoughts would produce nothing useful. She blew out a rugged breath, and emptied the basket onto her desk. Her hands shook as she sorted the letters. A pile of keeper's reports, one for order business and one for Briarwood. Keeper's reports made up the largest stack. She would start with those. Whatever was urgent at Briarwood would wait an hour, whilst she managed the work that gave her real purpose and, unexpectedly, soothed her soul. She reached for the first report and cracked the seal, smoothed it on her desk, and reached for the next one, until they made a tidy little pile. Things would rapidly become more complicated from this point. Shortly after she had started managing the keeper's reports, she understood why Sir Carew's, the Minister of Keeps, temper ran hot. The reports should have been simple and easy to deal with. The order had made clear what was to be in those documents, and what form they should take. Which was to say only one keeper in the region actually followed those specifications. The others treated the matter as though they were doing the order a favour to turn in anything at all, a practice on which Sir Carew lectured vociferously against. Not that many listened, which meant it was on Anne's shoulders to write back to the recalcitrant keepers and politely request the missing details, a process which would take well until the next report was due, and the cycle would begin again. This month she would try something new. She had created a list of required information and would pen copies of it with sufficient space left for the keeper to fill in their answers. The order had provided her with official order blue ink, which should help a bit. At least it would draw the keeper's attention, as it had hers when Mrs. Fortin included it in her letter, which she would get to soon enough. Keepers first. There was so much to be included in each report. It was easy to see why keepers gave up. Perhaps by clarifying and simplifying it a bit this way, she could obtain more useful information. She dropped her head in her hands. Who was she fooling? It would never be that easy. Even if she got the required data, compiling it took days, and then trying to make sense of it all. Only Sir Carew had any understanding of what the order asked of her. Though he was relieved to have her assistance, if anything it made him even more adamant that the letter of the accords be followed precisely. If only he would be amenable to simplifying the process for both the keepers and the order. But no, like so many things, hide-bound traditions took precedence over common sense. She pressed her temples. If only that might drive back the burgeoning headache. These matters would not be remedied now, so focus on the task at hand. Later, she would start trying to sort out how to manage the order, and other things. She pulled the keep map from her desk drawer, and the ledger where she kept her notes on each of the keeps from the cabinet on her right. She returned the other correspondence to the basket and moved it to the floor so she could spread out the large map. It took up the entire desktop, but it allowed her to identify where each keep was and which others were nearby. The estates were not evenly distributed throughout the counties. They clustered together where suitable lairs might occur. Reading the reports of nearby keeps at the same time often allowed her to extrapolate missing information, and that made Sir Carew happy. Or at least happier. Dorset and Somerset had fewer dragon estates than many other English counties, which was why a single regional under-secretary, Mr. Wynne, managed the region. Most of the keeps lay along the border between the two counties. None of those belonged to influential dragons. The few important keeps were in the central parts of the counties. Low-ranking dragons, smaller drakes, wyverns, and a large worm held the border keeps. The sort of dragons that avoided conclaves, despite the requirement to attend, who had little voice in matters, and who seldom filed complete reports. The sort of dragons who were likely to ignore trouble, or to be troublesome themselves. She indulged in a long, heavy sigh, the kind that did no good in company and often irritated people. But in private, it helped release just enough of the tense frustration to permit her to return to the task at hand. Montacute, near the centre of the Dorset and Somerset border, had written "no changes" as the report, and submitted it without a signature. She flipped open to that page of her ledger. Yes, she had remembered correctly. Every report she had received from Montacute's keeper, Mr. Phelps, had said exactly the same thing. Though it might be true, it seemed unlikely at best, and, at worst, smacked of deception. Montacute Keep was small, and the resident wyvern only permitted one minor dragon a living on it. The keeper sat at a major crossroads, and a public house stood at the edge of the estate, one thing that made it a rather undesirable keep, and rendered the resident dragon rather unhappy. It was the type of place that all but screamed out for an official visit. Crewkerne and Seaborough, the former in Somerset and the latter in Dorset, stood some 10 miles from Montacute, and 3 miles from one another. Back from the main roads, they were more desirable than Montacute, but with lowland terrain that provided little in the way of desirable lair situations. According to her notes, both of those dragons had complained numerous times about that matter. Seaborough wrote with the usual litany of complaints. But wait, that was something new. The daughter of the estate had a new beau, a non-hearer of whom the keeper and dragon did not approve. But it appeared a quick marriage was necessary. The ensuing half-blue family would have to be added to the lists to be monitored. Seaborough, the estate dragon, was already threatening to ban the girl and her husband-to-be from the territory. Oh, that was never a good thing. Crewkerne wrote of several failed fields. Yes. Seaborough had complained of that in the last several reports. The way Crewkerne described it, the damage sounded like what disgruntled fieldworms might leave in their wake. Perhaps the two instances were related. That would need to be checked out. Meagre harvests for any reason were bad for keeps and dragons. Apparently, dragons who were not hoarders still liked treasures, not unlike men liking money, and the produce of their territory counted as treasure. Failure to produce it could prove a serious problem, especially when the dragon had little else in the way of status or power. One of those things that the Order preferred to ignore as long as possible, hoping it would go away. To be fair, sometimes matters did disappear because the dragon lacked the dominance to push their case. But that did nothing to soothe the dragon's ire, and angry dragons meant ramifications, even if the Order pretended it did not. She rubbed her eyes with thumb and forefinger. When one looked too closely at the way the Order did business, it was a wonder that the dragons of England had not fallen into war and chaos. The Order said a great many pretty things, but often did little to accomplish them. Change would be difficult.